suppose, was, oh, sorry, that put me off a bit. So as a result, it changes how funding for medically orientated programs were at that time. So we have this interesting situation where we face two different organisations, which has some advantages, but also has significant issues around it, particularly if you are having to work in some parts of the faculty, which I never had to really worry about because the School of Education was slightly different. We only faced Kingston, we only have Kingston accredited programs. So I was happily doing that for a number of years until 2020, at which point it was decided to try and primarily improve the student experience, because we have students that are on Kingston programs that are taught at St George's and vice versa. So that's an interesting challenge. We had an old allied health school that was made up of 5 different professions, which was quite challenging as an organisational structure. And so it was decided that a new school would be created, one school. So we have a school of nursing, we would have a school of education, midwifery and social work, and then we would have a centre for allied health that would sit within St George's structures more effectively, because they have centres rather than schools or faculties. So that was something that happened in 2020. In the middle of the pandemic, I was asked to lead that new school. So I'm literally in the first few months of now being this overall head of school. That is obviously interesting in the context of COVID, as I'll kind of come onto several times. I suppose one of the things that we found, or I have found as a head of school, but my leadership team have as well, is some issues really around something like COVID suddenly revealing the strengths and of what you've got across these 3 professions, but also some of the challenges both internally and externally. I suppose the issues around the different powers, expectations, and the ability to be flexible within the requirements of PSRBs. Interestingly, looking at shared issues that we seem to be facing across education, midwifery and social work. And I suppose bringing together some of those shared issues and identifying language or ways of talking about some of those issues, so that I am able to have conversations with organisations such as Universities Alliance. So for me, it's been about connecting clinical and service user and school placement paradigms in a meaningful way, so that the Department for Education, which now obviously leads the university sector, can understand some of those issues in an overall way, and so that we're not having separate conversations across 3 different areas. For me personally, it's been quite difficult to move out of being a lead educator. So in other disciplinary areas, professional areas within our faculty, they often have this notion of being the lead midwife, the lead social worker, lead occupational therapist and such. So we've never had really that sense. I've never seen myself as particularly a lead educator, but I was the kind of go-to people for people to discuss educational issues or have an educational perspective. And I've now handed that over to the co-heads of department, because education has become a department within this new structure. So that's been interesting professionally and personally. It's quite hard to kind of move out of something that I've been quite passionate about pretty much all of my adult life, and sort of edge out of that and start to adopt this broader professional identity of supporting multiple professional areas. And also just for me, when I was approached about this over a year ago and what my thoughts would be about creating this new school, at that point, I suppose I thought it was exciting, and there was lots of possibilities around interdisciplinary practice. But I also thought what we would need to do is do lots of touchy-feely things to bring people together in this new way of working within a school. So we've not been able to do, certainly not been able to do any touchy-feely things. I've not been able to get around and see practice, not been able to meet in person partners in clinical and service settings. So that's been difficult for me, and as you all know, there's only so many online meetings you can do a day before you get quite fatigued about it. So it's an interesting situation we're in at the moment, but I think overall I think we've got a few people from the new school here. So overall, I think at the moment it's working well. We've had quite positive responses from across the 3 areas to the new school, although obviously it feels a bit odd at the moment because we're not actually for the most part co-located on the campus. So and we're all obviously very busy trying to manage our own lives as well as our professional lives at the moment. So it's yeah, it's an interesting situation at the moment. And I'll hand over to Carmel.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. So I'll pick up really a sort of the counter to that in terms of my role and a little bit about where we are at Middlesex. And then Marcus, am I going straight into the issue about professional identity? Yeah, and then it'll come back to you. Okay, so just so I know to watch my time as well. So hi, everybody. Really good to see, obviously, colleagues from Middlesex. Nice to see you. And obviously, hi to some other people that I don't know, but I do notice that David Nielsen is on this. So hi, David, long time. David and I go back when I was head of department in social work and mental health. So good to see you, or not if you're not on camera because I can't see you. But anyway, but good to see everybody. This is a really interesting topic, and I'm really very grateful for Lee and colleagues for inviting me to speak. I don't know if I know any more than you guys, to be quite frank. So I'll just speak from the heart, really, in terms of what I think some of the issues might be, and I'll sort of reflect, I think, a little bit, which I believe I'm being asked to do, which is as a head of a school, which is very much of different disciplines. You know, how does that work, or how do I see it work, or are we doing anything that we might be able to even build from or onto? But to put it into context, I took over as the head of the school for health and education, and that title belies what's actually in health and education, because health is actually nursing and all sorts of allied related to that, but also midwifery. And then it also takes everything to do with education, but it also takes social work, and social work is just not reflected in the title. So we do have a very large body of social workers. So there's a nice synergy, I suppose, across health and social care and education within our school. So we're 3 large departments reflecting those disciplines. We've an interesting history as well. I mean, I took over as the head of that school in January, and I have to say, January, not this year, January a year ago, but January a year ago was, of course, pre-COVID in that sense. And I think if anybody told me when I was taking over the role that you're now going to have to run the school from a computer, Carmel, I would have said, are you crazy? But then I have an amazing bunch of colleagues and I can't speak highly enough. And everybody seems to, at least fingers crossed, I know we're all getting a bit tired now, but have managed to do a sterling job online. And so and we've managed to do a little bit, I think, about trying to pull together as a school, but I'll come back to that. But just to give those who are unfamiliar with Middlesex our structure, just so you can understand, we've had an interesting probably 24, 36 months in that we've gone through two new VCs. So we had a lovely VC joined us after a very long established reign of a previous VC who it was the longest serving, I think, VC in the country. But basically we were taken over, or we had a new VC who came and he played with us for about 18 months. And in that time, he did move the boundaries around a little bit. And where we were previously schools, and the School of Health and Education was one of those, we also had psychology in there, we also had sports, we had a lot of other disciplines. And then there was a shift to move us all into faculty structures. And in that faculty shift, we lost a few people from our school in terms of discipline. They went over to another faculty called Science and Technology. But our school was brought in under what we called professional and social sciences. So we were wrapped in with business and law. And they stayed as schools and we stayed as a school, but now we were under a big umbrella of faculty. And I mention that because there's some lessons I think we've learned by moving around some of the internal boundaries and whether they can assist or hinder about interdisciplinary work or breaking down silos. So we may get back to that. But having done that shift and change, and then it comes our new VC. And of course, as with any new boss, they like to try and move the tables and chairs around a little bit. And that's happened. But I mention that because we're now going back as a health and education, back to a faculty. It's same structure really by and large as we are as a school under a faculty, but we're now going to become our own faculty within the university. And that's yet to be unfolded really as to the good or the bad of that, but hopefully for the good. But I mention it because actually in the statement from our VC and our executive, they said that one of the drivers for changing the faculty back or changing the boundaries internally is the intention is to minimize internal silos and to help to create a more agile organization. And given the focus of today's discussion, I just thought it was interesting that the language that was being used was about these internal silos. So we're currently now going to be we're going to be a faculty. We're going to be a faculty, I think now it looking like of the group, health, largely nursing and midwifery and social work, and then education. We have, I think at the moment, a very high functioning school in actual fact. And we've made a couple of efforts even as a school within that new kind of structure to think about how we could start to work with each other. And where we previously in various other iterations, had research, sort of targets, and we had KPIs, and we were being driven by deputy deans or higher that you have to reach this and reach that. And so work together to go after grants because you might be able to get a pocket of money that nursing can't get. So social work, you lead, nursing might come in or vice versa. All of those mechanisms, to be fair, have been tried and tested by various individuals or groups. But we don't necessarily still make an awful lot of headroom, which is interesting. And the colleagues that have been participating in some of that might have some commentary as to why. But there have been some challenges, I think, within those kind of mechanisms where you force people together purely maybe driven by trying to get money or trying to get sort of access or a footprint somewhere. So when I took over a year ago, I actually had a meeting with some of our leads around research. And I said, rather than doing that, why don't we just try and get people together for discussions and maybe think across each of the disciplines, is there a common core area that we could work together and build? And so that group did. And what they've done is they've identified, as far as I know, and it's still active, that it's mental health that actually pulls us all together. So I'm just going to put that there. We can come back, but put that there as an issue. But equally, we also are interested in knowledge exchange. And similarly, what we've done is in our CPD activity, which is largely representative of our KE activity, we've brought together, again, a hub of people right across the disciplines about how we can share and work with each other. Now, those are very fledgling, I would say, and there are people here who are part of those groups who may wish to, when we get to Q&A and discussion, speak to the benefits of that. But that's what we're trying to do at the moment, for good or bad. But I wanted to just move in, if I can, to why I think we struggle around these silos in terms of interprofessional working or sort of different disciplines. And for me, in my experience, it's been a lot to do with professional identity. And I think this is some of the challenge that maybe gets in the way. So interprofessional collaboration, largely in the UK, I believe, has emerged as a means to improve health and social care outcomes and reduce costs. Everybody sees the benefit of that. there's a lot of value to that. And so we're familiar, particularly from our individual disciplines, and my own personal discipline is nursing. I'm a dual qualified adult and mental health nurse in terms of my practice area, and particularly around addiction, which was very multidisciplinary and multi-agency in actual fact in practice. So we're very familiar with multidisciplinary teams, shared roles, and particularly I've experienced from a line management going into practice side now, that a nurse would supervise social workers or social workers would supervise nurses, and there may be something similar in education. But similarly, we've seen a major shift over the last, I would say, 15, 20 years to generic type roles in practice. And I'm wanting to talk about practice for the moment, because I do think it bears enormously on what we do within our academic institution in our disciplines as educators of this workforce, and that we bring some of this history in and across the threshold into the university. So these generic types have started to emerge and become much more, much more, or increase in volume. And you'd see things like generic healthcare worker or mental health practitioner. And they, most of these roles are often accompanied by a change in clinical banding. So they're often aligned with non-registrants. They're known as non-registrants versus the registrants who would have the PRSB regulation and so forth. And of course, that suggests that they're also cheaper. So you can see where the policy would come and that would drive that. So I mentioned the world of practice, as I say, because basically as my school and the subject of the disciplines, we're preparing the next generation of that workforce. And largely, the people who are teaching, the academics, either from a research or KE activity, come from those backgrounds and are only too familiar with the history. The challenges of keeping a place at the table as a discipline. We've seen that in nursing. Nursing has been, personally, nursing has been undervalued for years. I suspect all other key workers would say the same, but they're losing their place at the table in terms of their voice. So given that's our history and given that's our culture, and there's huge competitiveness within the disciplines to stay at the table, I often wonder whether that then leaks into the need for interdisciplinary working, and whether we try and protect our own brand, so to speak. And does that get in the way? And does that actually forge, or in some respects enhance, silo type thinking, even at a sort of unconscious level? Because I think if any of us were asked individually, should we all work together, we'd all say yes. But I wonder why that doesn't happen so readily, I think, as it should. And I give an example. About 15 years ago, I was a curriculum lead. I was asked by one of the trusts, could you set up a postgraduate generic worker? And we set up what was now known as the trainee mental health worker. When I set that up, absolutely, both internally at Middlesex amongst nursing colleagues and externally through friends in my network, they said, well done, Carmel, you've just put the nail in the coffin of mental health nursing by delivering on that and setting up that course, which was fascinating. Real threat, real worry about their role, real about what does that mean to me and my discipline if we bring in those kind of cross-discipline, in effect. They would be an interdisciplinary kind of training. A worry about that. So does that leak into some of our thinking about silo working at the academic level? So I think that there's clearly every good reason for us to break down the silos. I'm certain any one of us here could list it in this discussion. But perhaps the resistance, as I say, or the stop and start in gaining any real traction may need us first to take a critical look at the defense of our professional identity, and what may be getting in the way of making room at the table for others to come in and have those conversations meaningfully and sustainably. And some of which is, to be fair, outside individual academic control, or indeed an institutional academic control, because it speaks to wider policy around workforce development. So I'm just going to stop and pause at that point. But I think that's sort of, from my experience, with the best will in the world, I think we're all trying in a very cramped area where we have very little time, actually, because professional training, as we know, just sucks up all of our energy and time because it's complex to teach this area. So when we are talking about research and KE, perhaps it's not surprising, given what I think might be some of the underbelly around this in terms of concerns and defense of our identities, but also there is a real time pressure. And so if you could speak to people who know your language and you don't have to defend yourself, perhaps maybe that's what's getting in the way as well. So I'll stop, Marcus, and pass over to you, because I know you're going to talk about the HE professional academic.
Yes, thank you. So obviously you create a new school and people say, well, what is the essence? What are you trying to achieve in this new school? And how do you bring together three areas of education? And we've got multiple different areas of education that we serve. So it's as you do at Middlesex as well. So education is not one, professional identity, it's multiple identities, midwifery and social work. So one of the terms that I've been using with staff is saying, well, you've got three professional areas that focus on helping people to thrive from the minute they're born through their lives, often in quite challenging situations, all the way through to end of life. So if we focus on the notion of thriving, what do we need to do in order to achieve the very best we can for our students? We have at Kingston an institutional aim to develop sought after students, but of course a lot of that is tied up in employment, so that our students will get jobs across the university, the kind of jobs that are more than just non-graduate jobs, etc. So it's a bit more tricky for our faculty, because people get jobs because of the nature of their training for a profession. And so that sought after one has been something we've had to contend with for a few years anyway. For me, one of the things I suppose that I've spent a long time listening to people talk about is their sense of being imposters. And I know imposter syndrome is one of those things that you get across different professions in general. But I think one of the things about the areas that we serve is the fact that we've come from practice. So we've come in from practice. The vast majority of people come in from practice. Their identities are often tied up in their professional status. And people are very proud of that professional status, but they want to move on for a multitude of different reasons. And so they enter into higher education, and suddenly you've got to adopt this new academic identity. And there's a whole language around that that's quite difficult to navigate. We've all been there. But there's also quite often assumptions about that you will understand the way things work, or that quite often there's assumptions about who you are. So a lot of the time, well-intentioned people will talk about, I remember a few years ago, there was debates about getting standard text for job adverts. And it had been written by people that clearly didn't understand the professional nature of the university, let alone within this faculty, where people aren't postdocs. They've not come from, vast majority have not come through that arts-based postdoc route. They've come in through practice. And so I think quite a lot of us feel that we're trying to navigate quite the complexities of working in a university. We're trying to navigate this sense of being an academic, but we're not quite sure how that relates to who we are and where we've come from. And somehow you have to try and marry those two up. And some people successfully are able to do that. They develop far more of a focused academic career. Other people feel that they're just constantly not achieving what they want to, either as a professional or as an academic. And so I think there is something around the HE professional academic. And I don't think universities have done that well to really celebrate this HE professional academic status. We have academic domains at Kingston. Everyone is chooses effectively the domains that they mostly align with. We have one around learning and teaching and one around professional practice. From the statistics in our faculty, the vast majority of people put themselves into those two areas, but we haven't done a lot really to help people, particularly around the professional practice element, celebrate and recognize the kinds of problem solving they're doing, which I'm sure the vast majority of people on this call have been doing this year, this interface between what it needs to happen in professional practice and how we manage to create education at the moment in quite difficult situations that serves that. And we don't do enough to nurture that, to celebrate that. I don't think we've done enough collaboratively across the universities, because we've all been siloed, neoliberal system that we're now in. So it's all very competitive. We don't work across universities particularly well to develop language around this HE professional academic in our different disciplinary areas. And so I think there's something that we need to do about that. And it is about firstly using those kind of domains, and different universities have different versions of that. But there is a growing number of universities that do take this notion of professional, they call it different things, but this notion of professional practice far more seriously, because it can be used for ref, it is refable, it is you know, keffable and teffable. So there is a lot more interest in that at the moment, but I think we have to try and find people to plot their way through an academic life as a professional academic, which isn't always about the high impact journal articles, and it isn't always about the huge grant capture. It probably is more than spending your whole career doing the stuff that Carmel's just said about the busyness of trying to deliver professional programs. And I've been a fan for years of saying we have to work much harder within our professional programs to try and remove those bits that take the time up. I was having a fascinating conversation this early afternoon with our head of department for midwifery, where she was almost embarrassed about a very small change they've made that has made a significant difference in all different areas, not just in terms of outcomes for students, but also in terms of the way in which they think about their practice in midwifery education. So I think we've got to do more to recognise and celebrate that. But also, as Carmel also talked about, the interdisciplinary elements that we've absolutely got to do better at. You know, we've got a notional focus on interdisciplinary education within our faculty, but we need to go much further in making that a lived reality of the student experience, I have to say. And it's some of these structural issues, but also some of the silo issues where people don't necessarily talk to one another, even though they're probably all saying the same thing. So overcoming that is quite important. We've had a teaching observation scheme within the university. It's not been very well received, but it was largely a peer-based observation scheme in which people from within the faculty, but different disciplinary areas, were observing each other. And although there were challenges around it, and certainly it's a model that needs to evolve, some of the most interesting things came from the conversations that people had afterwards. One of my colleagues did an observation of from education, did an observation someone in social work. A lot of the conversation with students was around the challenges of working with teachers, and some of the assumptions that teachers may have about the work that social workers do, and vice versa. And it was clearly an opportunity in which we should have had someone from education and social work in that conversation, quite like this, and you could explore some of those tensions. So even on simple level, it made her step back and think about, oh my goodness, do we do enough in teacher education to set our new teachers up to working in a multi-agency way? We never have done, I think, but that's something that faculties like ours should be able to do really well. And finally, the one thing I was going to say as well is that I've become very interested in the notion of design thinking recently, and the notion of design thinking being a way of tackling the wicked problems that exist in societies in general. And for me, I think that going back to that notion of the HE professional academic, that opportunity to actually go back to basics, go and see service users, go and see children, go and work with expectant mothers and all the rest of it, to actually see some of the challenges from their perspectives, see some of the challenges that are faced by professionals in the context that we are now in, and to work from the ground up about how an education looks across our professions, and then think about what the research opportunities might actually come from that as well. So yes, I'm now going to just move on from that onto looking at policy, and then Carmel's going to come in on that as well. So obviously we're now having to deal with multiple different, for me in particular, I mean, policy changes all the time in the Department for Education, but as we've seen in the last few weeks, but also just trying to learn a bit about the policy across our different professions has been interesting. And of course, you use the paradigms you're used to, so you start seeing the similarities between some of these areas. And over the last, I suppose, 10 years that I've been instrumentally involved in leading education and now this wider remit, I've had to obviously engage with some of this and been asked strategically to position the provision. Well, and it's interesting for me just looking at some of those similarities. So one thing at the moment that social work are experiencing is a real shift in focus away from the HEIs towards the employers. That is something that we saw in teacher education 10 years ago. Some of the same kinds of assumptions are absolutely there at the moment, but also there are subtle differences. And for me, it's quite interesting just to see the subtle differences that are that exist, that although there is change in social work, it feels to me, and we've got a few social workers on the call that might actually see it differently, but it seems to me at least some lessons have been learned about the need to have a big conversation and not to just do what happened to us in teacher education, which was ideologically driven. It's going to be school led. We're going to break all the quangos that existed to support that for a very long time, and we're going to throw it all up in the air. We're going to ask the schools to innovate, and we're going to expect the universities to fall into line or get out. So it's interesting just seeing kind of things like Teach First and some of the parallels in Step Up, looking at how skits as part of teaching school alliances, some of that may be seen now in some of the kind of wider teaching partnerships in social work. The kind of, I was talking just again this morning to our head of department for midwifery about how there used to be different standards and how for different stages in your career, and now there is just a flat set of standards. Exactly the same thing happened in teaching. We used to have different standards for training teachers, for newly qualified teachers, all the way through to post threshold. We have a flat set of standards now. So for me, actually being able to see some of the connection, well, first of all, seeing some of the problems helps. So you can see that some of the assumptions that are being made possibly won't work, because they will require too great a resource base. They will require too much expected knowledge of those people, those employers, those people in practice, that they just don't have time to get their heads around quickly, and so on. And for me, it's a recognition of saying, well, okay, we have to have a much bigger resource base to support these developments, at least to begin with. So how do you factor that into planning, and how do you then start to wean yourself off that over a period of time? So for me, some of it is about trying to look at, actually how do you preempt some of the problems that might come? But also there's other things that I've just found to be incredibly interesting. The social work teaching partnership for me feels exciting, and I think quite a lot of people in the field of teacher education would welcome something like that, that was, that was kind of being, that was formally constituted, but actually was trying to lead change and a much tighter relationship between different stakeholders. Whereas in education, we have a very broken system right now. But likewise, looking at some of the challenges around social work apprenticeships and some of the challenges that all apprenticeships have, and how we might learn for that in relation to moving forward with midwifery apprenticeships or teaching apprenticeships. So for me, I think it always seems overwhelming to look at all these policies and think about how we're going to support all of these different professional areas to be able to cope with some of these changes. But I've always been driven, and when I do a policy lecture to ITE students on this, I talk about the importance of critical agency in all of these policy developments that happen. And I think that we have to be critically engaged in these policy directions, and we have to feel that we have a vital contribution to make. And if we start to put compliance at the top of everything that we do, that's for me a recipe for disaster, because and I think in general we end up being far too compliant because we feel we have to do these things, otherwise we're going to get in trouble with PSRBs, and therefore it's going to be a risk to our accreditation, and we're going to have a whole host of work around that. So it's better to meekly comply with these directives and these policy agendas rather than actively critically engage with them and try and find a way through that makes you compliant but also subverts some of the policy directions that exist, because we know they will change.
Marcus, sorry but just getting on to compliance. So it's about 4:15. I'm sorry, both Carmel and Marcus, I don't know if there's sort of concluding comments that you'd like to make now, and then we could go to questions. Sorry to have to interrupt you, Marcus, there.
I'll go over to Carmel.
Thank you, Marcus. I think Marcus has made some fine points, really, and I would echo much of what he said. I just, in terms of policy area, the two that I do think, and it probably leans into the reasons to be hopeful. If you take a Venn diagram, I think we've got more in that center of our Venn between all those disciplines than we have outside, if that makes sense. And I think that there is a lot of hope for me in that. Certainly, just from my sort of an in summary experience is that, nursing, for instance, I mean, Marcus made a very strong point about how do we learn from each other, because we come to this, to different things at different times, particularly in relation to policy or government directive. And the two examples between education and social work are really fine examples of that. I think that from a nursing point of view, we are about to break the mold in nursing, primarily because of the pandemic and what has happened. Emergency standards have been introduced. We've learned to think differently outside the box, and we've certainly seen that we can survive even within that sort of framework. So I think that nursing is going to be interesting in the next 18 months to 2 years. We're still very much stuck in that old mode of nursing, in terms of, you have to do so many hours flying, otherwise you're not competent. Whereas a lot of our other professional colleagues have gone on, in other disciplines to just look at outcomes. So I think that, again, lessons to be learned and lessons to be brought to the PRSBs and say, but let's look at this across the piece. And I think there's a value in us coming together to understand how other disciplines or other professionals have done things, whether that's nursing to social work or social work to teaching and vice versa. The other thing I've often heard some colleagues is that certainly one of the things that nursing can lend to this, from my perspective, is that, there's a lot of problems with the applied side of the profession. And nursing does seem to have a very good network around that and demands that people are actually put on placements. They have to have a placement within the NHS. That's the next workforce. Whereas we know that that isn't. It's a lot of negotiation, as I understand, for education, a lot of negotiation for social work. And they can still say no. Well, that's unacceptable in one level, if you think about it. So what are some of the other lessons we can learn and share? Because that can't happen in nursing. So I just think that there is more for me, I have to say, in the Venn diagram center for all of us to share, if we can unpack some of those challenges that I spoke to earlier, which I do think are inherently in there, maybe as an unconscious bias, perhaps, and as I say, defense of our own little patch. But if we can raise ourselves above that, and I think individually, lots of people want to do it, but institutionally, structurally, policy-wise, it's difficult. For me, in terms of going back to interdisciplinarity, we've got a lovely example of a work that we've been doing for many years on interprofessional learning with our students. And we've been able to largely make it work for nursing and midwifery to come together as two disciplines, less so with social work. And then really it's been impossible for education, primarily structurally, not that education are resisting it, just been difficult to make it work. And one of the things that I find very frustrating is that there are so many common core subjects at our learner student level that we could be doing in our curriculum at the undergraduate level in terms of pre-qualifying. But because we all come to our revalidations at a different time, and we have to, as Marcus has just mentioned, we have to meet the machine of the RSPB and the curriculum and so forth, we can't get into those levels of discussion to say, well, could there be common core modules across some of these subject areas where students start to learn literally from the minute they cross into the university? And we as the academics have to come together and deliver that jointly. And I think it's through the practical application of doing things together that have meaning for us that there may be an opportunity to widen the conversation, which would have a ripple effect at all levels, both from research, KE, policy, and so forth. So I'll stop at that, Rebecca.
I had my finger over my unmute button. Okay. So thank you both ever so much for sharing those thoughts with us. We've had sort of a statement, a really interesting sort of comment that Sophie has put into the chat. And I don't know if she'd like to expand on that and maybe talk about where she's sort of coming from. I mean, which particular discipline she works within. I'm presuming you can all see the chat. So I'm wondering if Sophie, is there anything you'd like to add to your comment about that lack of understanding and about interprofessional discussion from your own viewpoint or your own context?
Yeah, sure. I don't know, can you hear me? Because I'm on a really cranky laptop.
No, it sounds fantastic.
Okay. I'm at Kingston University in the School of Nursing, and I work in clinical skills and simulation. But my background's in A&E, so I'm kind of quite used to working with lots of different disciplines and sort of knowing how a good team can work and the barriers of that. And I think it's kind of exactly what Carmel's just been talking about, trying to get the students to work together from the off, trying to get them to understand what each other's roles are, their scope of practice, because actually at the end of the day, the vast majority of people are there for the patient, the service user, the child, whatever, and that's the focus. And so we all have the same goal, but we don't always necessarily go about it in the right way or the same way. And I think that professional language is really important as well and really interesting, because I don't think we all speak the same professional language. So I think that then leads to sort of misunderstandings, frustrations, lack of respect, all those sorts of things that, you know, we're really familiar with, aren't we? That was it.
No, thank you very much for that. And I mean, I think it's also interesting just reflecting on the students' own role within this and their own role within creating their own professional identity, and how quickly it sometimes seems that they do that almost within weeks of starting whatever course it is they're on. So thank you very much for that.
Could I just come in on there, Rebecca? Yes. I think that is a really good point, Sophie. And I mean, I don't think it's ever been achieved, but just, you know, coming up with a lexicon or something of this kind of shared language would be really useful. And I don't think it's necessarily ever been attempted. but just in terms of the different roles, I mean, I remember as a new teacher having to go to a multi agency meeting for a member, someone in my form group. And it was the most depressing experience of my life because nobody had prepared me for it. I didn't know who all these people were in the room. I was hearing incredibly personal stuff about this year 7 tutee of mine. It was harrowing, absolutely harrowing. And I thought afterwards, why did no one prepare me for this? What did I think my role might be in that? And where do I go with this information right now? And I think, and I'm not totally sure that new teachers in that situation these days wouldn't have a similar situation to me. Now that was the days before kind of every child matters and widening participation, but it really struck me that when I joined this faculty in particular, with a real focus around, we believe, don't we, in interprofessional education, that we still find difficulties in making it a lived reality.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, just before the pandemic, I got together with one of my other colleagues and someone from the social work department, AGA, and we did a very small tabletop exercise with the some social work students and some adult nursing students, and with basically a view to sort of just try and think about working collaboratively and understanding each other's roles. And it was there that we really sort of appreciated that this language that they were each speaking was quite different, and they weren't really listening to each other or understanding each other. And it just really made us think, gosh, if we could upscale this, there could be so much learning for the sort of for all the schools and for the students themselves. So yeah, I think but it's logistically going to be very difficult with the numbers and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think it's something that really should be explored more if possible.
No, thank you. That's really interesting points. Thank you. Irena, I know you put something in the chat, but I know you also sent in a question. Now I'm aware we're a little bit short of time, but if you could just briefly sort of summarise what your question is, and then we can ask Marcus and Carmel maybe for responses, or if anyone else would like to join in, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. You're on mute, Irena.
I think I'll leave the written question that I've sent for another day probably, but I just wanted to make a comment. I think we've been talking about all sorts of things in this hour, and from teaching students and roles and multidisciplinary working, and for doing research and knowledge transfer and all of that kind of thing. But really, I was expecting that we should spend a little bit more time about what I see as an explosion in all of our disciplines. And this is due to COVID. We actually, Carmel mentioned the changes that may be coming in nursing in the next 18 months. I think beyond that as well. The changes are going to be immense, and what we need to do really is to decide: are we going to kind of be spending a lot of time trying to change the curricula at this point in time, or are we going to spend time to be exploring and researching and getting in touch, not just with people from our own schools and our own disciplines, but with people totally outside our own disciplines, because that is where the creative and things go. Why nurses, for example, need to get in touch with technologies. So much technology has been used during the COVID, which actually it kind of, one would could question, why haven't the nurses been using these technologies before to make their roles easier, or to find some more time to do their work more in a more satisfactory way and more quality and all of that kind of thing. We have seen people who are, why don't we join the people from we have sewing courses and art courses in our university. There were people trying to do, PPE and masks and all sorts of, basic technologies that really need to be developed even further. Look at the poor people who are wearing those masks and they're getting all the ulcers on their faces. And this is not a technology that is reached its peak. It needs to be developed, and we need to be, I'm talking about nurses now, but I could talk about the teachers as well, in terms of all the change that have happened in education. Everything is through online and other ways of delivering this, from the children's education up to university education and so forth. And I think this is what we need to be concentrating on, in my view, in my opinion, at this moment in time. What we have done, and we will continue to do for a while, and it is working. But the roles are going to be changing. If we don't do them, and if we don't think about them ourselves, the politicians and other powerful people are going to come and tell us what to do. So for me, the debate is what we have debated is it was very nice, but it wasn't radical enough, and it wasn't really sharp enough for us to see this urgency and this energy that we need to be finding, and we need to be coming together with all sorts of people. And my question primarily was for the two leaders, for Marcus and Carmel, how are you going to enable that? Because within our schools we can form things ourselves, and we're happy to find and speak about. But when we are coming outside of our and we should be coming outside of our comfort zones and the practices that we're currently delivering, we need teachers and researchers need support, need inspiration, need resources, and you give them that, and they will excel. I'll leave it there because
I know we're down to a minute. If I could quickly say, Irina, you always inspire me, I have to say, with the particularly because I know you are our tech queen and so to speak, with robots and whatever. But you're absolutely on the money. I don't think anybody would disagree with anything you've said. In fairness, I think it is extremely inspiring. I think that if you look at Middlesex, we in our 2030 strategy, ironically, and those colleagues in Middlesex will have seen that they, maybe it's a little bit of a hook, but they went out to kindergarten almost, primary school children, and said, what is your university going to look like? And of course, they were all mentioning robots, and it's going to be this and that. And of course, you're absolutely, the entire environment has literally done a 180. I mean, it's shifted off its axis in terms of tech, and every single discipline we've referred to at the moment could absolutely avail itself. I think it's almost, in some respects, we need to have a sort of a parallel working group, because in reality, we are all working just to keep status quo, not go underwater. Put aside the pandemic, but even still, just delivering what we have to deliver in the university, I think that's often the ask. And knowing colleagues are working to the absolute maximum of that as a leader, I sometimes feel I can't ask any more. But I do think as a university and as an institution at a strategic level, we should be having hubs and focus groups that are pulling those disciplines together, who are future-proofing and looking at the sustainability and working that into their strategy. And then actually
new courses
and delivering
new courses.
Correct.
Correct. Has money to employ high power, a lot of people up there with very high salaries. I'm sorry, you may not agree with me, but we have to demand from the university from the Vice Chancellor that resources are made available. And if we don't have them, we have to borrow them and give them to the people, because otherwise we're not going to survive.
Can I just come in there? Because actually, Irina, my next point, but we didn't get to it, was around our looking forward. So that was going to be a big part of my looking forward, was around the potential around technology and what we're learning from responding to COVID. And I'm also, so yeah, maybe we should have done it earlier and given everyone reasons to be hopeful throughout the whole thing. One thing, I think universities do recognise that. I'm leading a blended learning project across the university at the moment, where I'm working with colleagues across different faculties. We are focusing exactly on this, that where are these synergies across areas of, and we've got some going on in the university, but not to the extent we could be doing. And we have to, we have to play an important part in driving innovation. So I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the things that obviously we've now learned is that being able to do high quality professional education in an interdisciplinary way is definitely supported by this kind of technology, because we can bring people together in a way that would have been impossible in a kind of practice-based way.
A pandemic to make us.
I know, I agree. No, I agree. I absolutely agree.
We knew that, but we were not doing anything, and it took a pandemic, and we were forced to take on these paths that. Right. And we hate the pandemic, but
it's very interesting. I totally agree.
Positive is really this immense change, which
I think two things have struck me. There's two things that struck me recently. I'll say very quickly because of the time. But one thing, I was on a wonky seminar about the 3.0 technology, 3.0 and everything, and they talked about we spend trillions on buildings, we spend millions on IT tech, something like that, which I think is absolutely right, and we've got it the wrong way around for far too long, and it has required this to make us change really quickly. And also all of the literature I'm having to read around leading this blended learning project talks about some of the, it's all historic, so it talks about all the ways you help universities to become truly blended and interdisciplinary and all the rest of it. And of course we've done it in months. So I think you're absolutely right to raise some of these issues. We have to be working in that particular way. I think that was part of what I was saying around design thinking, because that is a paradigm that's come from design. It hasn't come from other areas, but using that approach where you start at base level and you think about what is the unidentified needs here. You talked about face masks, but what are the unidentified needs across our professional areas that are actually in common? And how do you then build new knowledge, new technology, new ways of working that are able to achieve great value for society? So I think you're absolutely right to raise that. But the challenge always, as some people have, I think, identified, is that we are often very stuck in our ways of doing, our ways of thinking, and our ways of seeing, and until we can find spaces where we can do this sort of thing, we're not going to move things on, because technology, blended learning is still effectively about how do you transmit knowledge in disciplinary areas.
We have to be forced to get to outside our zones, and also we have lots of resources.
Can I say, Irene, one of the reasons we may be forced, and this is, I know we're way over time, but just another one, and it may be that we need to come back and another discussion later, but one of the threats to that is private industry in education. And that's one of the things that's threatening all of our disciplines, that they're moving in healthcare, private institutions, universities being set up, and they will invest the money. Let's put it that way on technology.
Google
is going to invest the money, and we will be caught with our pants down. Let's put it that way. If we don't wake up to that fact, because it's already happening. Let me tell you, I can see it in nursing, certainly.
Yes. I think a lot of the traditional courses are going to go, because they're going to be replaced with a different way, as a shorter period of time, more flexibility, more. Who wants to come and do a master's for 2 years and come to the university and travel and all of that kind of thing? Nobody. And who wants to wait? If I'm an employer and want to sponsor somebody to do a master's, do I want to wait for 2 years until something comes? The immediate, everything nowadays has to be done fast. And I like, it's nice to think that we're going to go to the schools and we're going to start from the bottom. The foundations exist. There is a lot of things that we already know. We don't need to go and ask for it again. It's already out there. But what we need to do is to take it to the application level, to another level. I despair sometimes, because I do not see much change and much innovation happening. And whilst
can I just jump in, Irena, because I'm kind of conscious that we're having that terrible moment of one by one people are disappearing and saying sorry in the text, and
yeah, sure.
In 5 minutes it'll just be you and me and Carmel shouting at each other. So I want to draw this to a close. I mean, we've got Marcus and his exciting project looking at blended learning across the university, and Carmel saying we better get our function to regroup at the end of the year and look forward and think about what we've learned and what we can take forward. So I'll chat to Rebecca and see if we can organise a part 2, which is all about thinking what we're going to change in the future, and thinking about exciting possibilities. Can I just thank Carmel and Marcus for sharing their thoughts, and for everyone else for sharing their experiences, and invite you to come back to the Kingston group and the Middlesex group, and we'll pick up some other strands of potentially common practice along the way as well. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.